Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulihil amin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa man da'a bi da'wati wa nahaja manhaja wa jahada fi sabili ajma'in. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. Perhaps my only main contribution today would be to become a reason for you to come together and to give you a topic to discuss. And I see a number of ironies here today in this session. Like I am from Malaysia coming to Triple IT to talk about Islamization. We learned Islamization from Triple IT long ago when I was in Bangladesh. And then another irony, as Dr. Amin mentions, that Triple IT now is in the process of abandoning the subject. Not the subject, the content, but the term itself. Some literary work that I read long ago when I was an undergraduate student. We read essays by Addison, Steele, the British authors, and there is a funny character called Sir Roger de Coverley. And Sir Roger de Coverley, he visits some rural areas, and he finds that lifestyles and concepts and ideas which were prevalent in the city long ago are still working in the village. And the city had abandoned those lifestyle and ideas long ago. So I think the same thing happens here with the term Islamization. But I think all of us believe that the term itself is not the main focus of the entire project that we are talking about. We are more concerned with the content, what it involves, what we in this movement, in this intellectual movement are doing and what we are supposed to do. And this paper is actually a reflection of my own background and of my own encounter with the subject, English Literary Studies. I came from a madrasa background. I did my first 12th year education in madrasa, and then I switched to Western education. I chose English literature as my undergrad subject, and which caused huge uproar in the family. Especially my father, he was totally upset because I chose this subject, and he was worried that I might turn to be an atheist or a secular or agnostic. Now, long after that event, literally my father and some of my teachers in madrasa, they shed tears because they were worried that this boy who was doing well in madrasa education and who they expected, they dreamed to be a big alim, they planned to send me to Saudi Arabia, Al Madinah University to get more Islamic sciences and this and that, but eventually I turned to Dhaka University and chose English literature. So now after a number of years, I reflect on my father's tears, why he cried when I chose English literature as my subject. And I believe that my father was not illogical in being upset for my choice of subject, because when I look around and I see that people who go to university to study this subject, they undergo some changes in their life, or they pretend to accept or adopt Western lifestyles without any deep understanding of English literature or their own cultural values or Western values. So obviously there is a huge gap between Islam and English literature. Some time ago I talked about quote-unquote Islamization of English Literary Studies at Bangladesh Institute of Islamic Thought in Dhaka. And I found a huge amount of unease and discomfort among the people in front of me, especially English literature professors who are professionally, in their academic life, they are English literature professor, but in their personal life, they are very good Muslims. And they found it difficult to reconcile these two words together, Islam and English literature, as if they were worried that next time I would come with Islam and communism and Islam and secularism that put two things together. In other words, they found it inconceivable to bridge, to make a kind of relationship between English and English and Islam as a religion. So I believe that this kind of unease and discomfort is not totally unfounded, because there is an undercurrent in the subject itself and in the way that people expose to the subject they behave. And it goes back all the way to the introduction of the subject in the colony, especially in India when it was first introduced. And another big irony is, with regard to this subject, is that English literature was first introduced in India as a subject of study, not in Britain. It was introduced in India in the 1830s as a subject of study at tertiary education at universities. And it took about 90 years for it to be introduced at Oxford and Cambridge in Britain, which is discussed in details in a book by Robert Eagleston. The title of the book is Doing English. So this is how the subject itself has a colonial background, has a kind of colonial genesis. And the reason that the subject was introduced was to facilitate colonialism in a smoother way. Up until 1830, the British government used to give huge funding to Christian missionaries in India, and they thought that if they can convert local people to Christianity, it would be easier for them to colonize them and they will be receptive to colonial rule. But after some thought that, they came to a conclusion that it's not very wise to spread Christianity and at the same time to colonize a group of people, and they came to realize that Christianity has a moral message, and that moral message is based on love and mercy, and colonialism is definitely an exploitative adventure, an enterprise that is there to plunder the land than to exploit local people. So they didn't want to get engaged in any moral question. That's why they thought that it's better to introduce English literature instead of spreading Christianity. It will serve the same purpose, but it will not involve any moral question. And we all know that it went through debates after debate. There were two groups of scholars, Anglicists and Orientalists. The Anglicists believed that they should introduce English education alone, and the Orientalists, they argued for English, Sanskrit and Arabic in India. Eventually it was because of Thomas Babington Macaulay's persuasive argument that the English education was solely funded by the British government. And the argument that Thomas Babington Macaulay gave in British Parliament was that he said, "I have traveled across the length and breadth of India and I have not seen one person who is a beggar, who is a thief. Such wealth I have seen in this country, such high moral values, people of such caliber that I do not think we would ever conquer this country unless we break the very backbone of this nation, which is her spiritual and cultural heritage. And therefore I propose that we replace her old and ancient education system, her culture, for if the Indians think that all that is foreign and English is good and greater than their own, they will lose their self-esteem and their native culture, and they will become what we want them, a truly dominated nation." And it was because of such persuasive argument that the British government, they adopted and they passed it as a law, and they said, His Lordship, the Lord is Governor General of India, William Bentinck, His Lordship in Council is in opinion that the great object of the British government ought to be the promotion of European literature and science among the natives of India, and that all the funds appropriated to education would be best would best be employed on English education alone. And this is how English literature was introduced in India. And now, even at that time, colonial officials in India, they predicted that that law that established English literature as a universal subject would have far-reaching consequences. For example, the Allahabad-based Anglo-Indian newspaper, The Pioneer, established in 1865, made this remark on the experiment with Western English education, and it says, "The experiment of Western education going on in India is one which has no parallel in the world's history." And then Lord Trevelyan also made a similar kind of comment. That he said that even after we become dust in our graves, this law, this decision will have far-reaching consequences. And we see its reflection in today's world. In India alone, there are millions of students who study this subject. There are more English literature students in Bangladesh than in Britain because of the size of population. There are more English literature students in India alone than in all English-speaking countries put together. And in the Muslim world, we have millions and millions of students studying this subject. And in today's world, like in the context of a country like Bangladesh, most brilliant students of the humanities chose this subject to study because it offers them prestige and it gives them a greater certainty to get a good job in the government or in the private sector. So this is how we are having a huge number of students choosing this subject. But at the same time, there are a greater number of students who are also being delinked, disalienated from their local culture because they pretend to be Western. They chose to, they prefer to follow Western lifestyle in their personal life, in their professional life. And this is how Muslim societies actually are losing a big number of students because of their inculcation in this subject. And there is a culture of mimicry, like we tend to follow Western cultures, as I said. And there are some very life examples in my own life, like when I first came to Dhaka University and I started studying this subject, my fellow classmates, they were surprised that I still go to masjid after studying this subject. And one very good friend of mine, he said, "Mahmud, if you really wanted to pray, then why did you choose this subject?" So this is how there is a kind of preconceived notion that once you study this subject, you are already a Western man or woman. You don't have to follow your local culture or religion. You just go with the flow and follow the crowd and behave as you are supposed to behave. And this is explained in great details in Franz Fanon's book, Black Skin, White Mask. And here in the context of French colonialism, he shows how the colonized are desperate to follow the colonial culture. And he gives wonderful examples in that book. One example goes like this. One student from Martinique, he came to Paris to do his PhD. And he spent 3-4 years in Paris, then he went back to his native country. And when he came to Paris, he was about 25 years old, a mature man, not a child. And he was born and brought up in Martinique, and he followed their culture, and he used to help his father, who is a farmer, a peasant. And when he went back to Martinique after 4 years, he found his father was handling a plow that is used to cultivate land. And he pretended to his father that he didn't know what a plow is. He said, oh father, what is this? And he cannot forget about plow only after 3 or 4 years of staying in Paris. And his father was a clever man. He said, wait, I will tell you what a plow is. after a few moments, his father hit him with the plow so hard. Then he immediately remembered what a plow was. So this is how Franz Fanon also described this kind of tendency to imitate the colonizers because of Western education. For the last few years, I have been hugely interested in this area to see what's the relationship between Islam and English literature and why we have to behave in a certain manner when we are in the English department. And this is why I came up with few ideas how to teach this subject, and this is what I try to do in my professional life as a lecturer. And I came up with these three ideas, with these three agendas while we teach this subject. Number one is molding the self and others with Islamic values, that is also called Islamization, quote unquote, Islamization of the self. Number two is Islamizing literary text, that is identifying predominant ideas inherent in literary text and then looking at them from Islamic perspectives. The final one is reforming the curriculum. These are the three ideas, the three agendas that I personally follow while I teach the subject to my students, and this is still at a very primary level, and I will be benefited from by your feedback if you have any. What I mean by molding the self and others with Islamic values or Islamization of the self is actually to embrace the Islamic notion of teaching, or to embrace the concept of murabbi. In the context of Malaysia, the word murabbi is very popular. Murabbi is someone who is not simply a transmitter of knowledge to the student, but also someone who influences the student in their everyday life, in their lifestyle. And I also talk about extensively about the concept of teaching in Islam. And I find a hierarchy in teaching. For example, the hierarchy is of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a teacher, and then the second most important teacher is Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then we are teachers or lecturers. This is the hierarchy. And in this hierarchy, we need to, see what our Prophet ﷺ did as a teacher, as a prophet to his companions. And there are several verses in the Quran that talk about his work plan, his agenda as a teacher. For example, كما أرسلنا فيكم رسولا من أنفسكم يتلو عليكم آياته ويزكيكم ويعلمهم الكتاب والحكمة. So there are a few tasks that our Prophet did. One important task that I highlight, emphasize, is the purification of the heart. وَيُزَكِّيهِمْ. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also says He purifies whom He pleases. So this purification of the heart, the purification of the self, it should be there in all subjects, not only in English literature, but whatever subjects we teach in the context of today's world, not only because of religious decadence or religious crisis, but also because of moral crisis. Because we are simply producing some robots at many universities who have no moral concern, who have no concern for humanity. And maybe you know the book by Harry Lewis of Harvard University, who wrote the book called Excellence Without a Soul, How a Great University Forgot Education. And in this book he talks about how Harvard, presumably number one university in the world in some subjects, he says Harvard has forgotten education. In his view, the education that Harvard provides is not education. This is simply some facts and figures to students who become CEO and this and that, and they have no concern for morality or for humanity. So my first agenda of teaching this subject is a common one, that is the purification of the soul, which we have to do in the classroom. And this goes across religions, not only with Muslims or Hindus. It has to be practiced by all people of all religious groups, because we face a crisis, a moral crisis, and we have to address it. And the second one is Islamizing literary text. Forgive me, I'm still using the word Islamizing. Maybe if we have to follow IIIT, we'll have to come up with different terms. But in my paper, this is still there. So by Islamizing literary text, I mean that we will find some text, English literary text, which are fully in agreement with Islamic values. And we will find some other text which may not be in agreement with Islamic values and with Islamic concepts. For example, when we teach Victorian literature, most of the novels of Charles Dickens will be in agreement with Islam. I mean, he promotes social justice, he promotes the rights of the orphans and this and that, and we may not have any problem with such texts. And when we teach Roald Dahl television for the children, where he talks about the demerits and the harms of children watching television and the concept of parenting, how the parents should encourage their children to read more and watch less. So with this kind of text, we may not have any problem. And there are a huge number of texts which promote the same kind of ideal that Islam is in agreement. But unfortunately, we will have some other texts which may not be in agreement with Islam. For example, we in English literature we have a number of poems that are called carpe diem poetry. Carpe diem means eat, drink, and be merry. You just seize the day. You enjoy your life. For example, when Andrew Marvell says to his choir mistress, or John Donne writes Flee, the poem Flee. In this kind of poems, they invite women to comply with their sexual advances. So when we teach this kind of literature, this kind of literary pieces, if we do not interpret these poems from Islamic perspective, then we are in a real danger. We are propagating a kind of sexual permissiveness, and we are trying to, and this is how my teachers, Muslim teachers, taught me. Andrew Marvell and John Donne, no concern about sexual morality. So they simply reproduce what is in the text. And this is being done in hundreds of universities around the world, or thousands of universities around the world, in the Muslim world. So when we teach this kind of subjects, we must tell our students that this is what is in the text and this is what Islam says, and we cannot force you to follow what this or that. This is our duty to explain to you this is what Islam says, and if you want to stick to your religious values, then this is what you are supposed to do. And then when we look at literary pieces from Islamic perspectives, I see a tendency of kind of apology, like even though some literary texts are not compliant with Islamic teachings, we try to force a kind of bridge between Islam and those texts. To my surprise and shock, I found one text, one thesis, and the title is Finding the Middle Path, Assimilation, Identity and Islam in Hanif Qureshi's The Black Album. Hanif Qureshi, in his writing, he makes it very clear that this book is a critique of Islam. And in this book, he says that religion is made by people, and there are many good things, better things that can be created by people, created by human beings. So there is no need to go to religion and to follow a code of conduct. So this is the basic thesis of this novel. And this reminds me that if we want to undertake this project seriously, we need to produce people with good Islamic knowledge and with good grounding in the subject, as Taha Jabir al-Alwani explains in his article yesterday and today. And the third task that I believe is important when we teach English literature specifically is reforming the curriculum. We must understand that the subject was introduced as a colonial program. This is obvious and nobody contests this idea. It's written in every pages of post-colonial studies virtually. So we also need to understand that the syllabus that was introduced earlier was also designed by that kind of purpose, that colonial purpose. And Edward Said once was invited by some Arab universities to review their literature curriculum, and he was horrified when he found that they were following the same curriculum that was introduced decades or even centuries ago during the colonial period. So there is not much change in the curriculum, in the syllabus. When you talk about contemporary British literature, there are dozens of good Muslim authors. They are British and they are Muslim. Since 2006, there has been one literary project called Muslim Writers Award in Britain. And they have been giving awards since 2006 to Muslim writers, and there are some well-established writers by this time. For example, Laila Abu Laila, Shelina Jan Muhammad, and for non-fiction writer, you can think of Ziauddin Sardar and this and that. But nothing was there. What was more shocking was that in the syllabus that I inherited in 20th century literature, writers like Marmaduke Pickthall and Martin Lynch were absent. Marmaduke Pickthall wrote dozens of novels, nearly 2 dozen novels. And there was a time when he used to produce 1 novel a year. And in some years, he produced more than one. So up until he left Britain for India, until I think he left in 1920. He went to India and then he lived until 1935, and then he came back to Britain and he died in 1936. So until he left for India in 1920, he was a literary giant in Britain. Writers like D.H. Lawrence and E.M. Forster used to regard him as their mentor. But for some reason, perhaps because of his acceptance of Islam, he has been deleted from literary history. In South Asia, we have 50% Muslims and 50% non-Muslims. So this demography should be reflected in literature also. We have many good writers in English. The first South Asian writer who wrote in English is a Muslim, Sheikh Din Muhammad. But these kind of writers are totally forgotten. They are totally deleted from literary history. So I believe that this is a huge project to work on the curriculum of the English literature at different universities, especially in the Muslim world. And I believe once our lecturers and students are familiar with this issue, with this debate, and they will be receptive, because nobody wants to neglect a writer who deserves to be studied, who deserves to be discussed. So these 3 are basically my ideas, and which I try to implement in my teaching as a lecturer, and I believe that this area has more potential and this area needs to be discussed and debated even more. And with this I conclude, and I would be highly grateful to if you can give me your ideas so that I can, as a young academic, I can enrich myself and I can implement your ideas. Assalamu alaikum.